Imagine looking at a sprawling city of 2 million people.
Okay, yeah, that's a lot of people.
Right. Millions of individuals going to work, paying taxes, just living their daily
It's just
lives.
everyday stuff.
Exactly. Now imagine a terrible, violent crime is committed on one single street corner by like a handful of people.
Right. A localized tragedy.
Yeah. And if someone pointed to that one street corner and demanded we condemn the entire metropolis, you'd probably say that's not just illogical, it's incredibly dangerous.
Oh, absolutely. It doesn't make any sense at all.
Well, welcome back to PoliticallyX. Today, we are stepping right into the middle of a highly complex, incredibly sensitive, and rapidly evolving news cycle.
It's the heavy topic for sure.
It really is. Think of this deep dive as your shortcut to understanding the intensely debated role of gender identity in modern mass shootings.
And the discourse around it is moving incredibly fast, often leaving context completely in the dust.
Just a quick ground rule before we dive into the deep end today. The source material we are unpacking is based on a recent News Nation panel discussion from Katie Pavlich tonight.
Right, so we're looking at a specific perspective here.
Exactly. This is a right-leaning, centrist debate featuring politically charged viewpoints. And I want to be very clear to you listening, we aren't here to endorse these political viewpoints.
No, not at all.
We aren't taking a side, and we aren't validating or invalidating their claims. Our job is strictly to impartially report the content provided. We're just mapping out the architecture of their arguments exactly as they appear in the original source material.
Yeah, we want to decode the mechanisms behind these arguments. We're looking at the why and the how of what these panelists are asserting, bypassing the outrage to get to the structural logic of their positions.
Right, so you can understand the battle lines being drawn in this national conversation. We promise to keep it structured, free of unexplained jargon, and to give you multiple perspectives without that overwhelming feeling of information overload.
Sounds like a solid plan. Where do we start?
Let's get right into the incidents that sparked this specific panel, because they focus on a string of recent tragic events. The anchor incident cited in the source was a horrific shooting at a Rhode Island hockey rink by a suspect named Robert, or Roberta, Dorgan.
God, yeah. It was awful.
It was. This attack left 2 family members dead and 3 others wounded.
And the panel places that Rhode Island tragedy within a broader, grim context.
Yeah.
They aren't just, looking at this in isolation. They're trying to draw a line between multiple high-profile tragedies.
Yeah, they specifically link this to an 18-year-old transgender-identifying former student who killed 8 students at a school in British Columbia.
Awful.
And they bring up a transgender-identifying gunman who shot over 30 people, killing 2 children, at a Minneapolis Catholic school.
Wow.
And then they also reference a transgender biological woman who killed 3 students and 3 staff members at a Nashville Christian school in March of 2023.
The human toll across these events is just devastating. But the core tension in the source material, the spark that ignites this specific debate, it centers on the Rhode Island case.
Right.
Specifically, the massive disconnect in how law enforcement communicated about it to the public.
This is exactly where the friction starts, because in the Rhode Island case, the police explicitly stated that the suspect's transgender process was completely irrelevant to their investigation.
They used that exact word, irrelevant.
Yes, irrelevant. But then court records surfaced that paint a drastically different picture of the suspect's immediate environment.
Wait, what did the records show?
Well, the records show the suspect's wife cited gender reassignment surgery and narcissistic personality disorder traits in her divorce filings.
Oh, wow. So it was directly mentioned.
Yes, and the suspect's father-in-law reportedly wanted him out of the house specifically because of this transition.
Okay, just to clarify that clinical term real quick. When the filings mention narcissistic personality disorder traits, they're referring to a psychological profile characterized by a deep need for admiration, coupled with a profound lack of empathy for others.
Right, which is intense.
Yeah, when you inject that kind of psychological volatility into a contentious divorce centering around a gender transition, you have an incredibly explosive domestic situation.
Okay, let's unpack this. Think of the investigative process like trying to read a highly complex novel. The police are essentially reading the last page, the crime itself, and looking for the most direct, immediate plot device that caused it.
Like, did they do it for money? Was it revenge?
Exactly. That is what relevant motive means in a strict legal sense. But the public and the panelists in our source, they're trying to read the whole book.
They want the overarching themes.
Right. They are looking for sociological patterns.
Right.
When the public sees a cluster of incidents and senses a pattern, but official channels boldly declare that suspected pattern irrelevant, it creates a massive vacuum of trust.
What's fascinating here is the friction between the micro-investigation and the macro narrative. I mean, law enforcement operates with a very narrow, legally defined focus. They want to secure a conviction based on immediate criminal intent.
Which makes sense for them.
Right, but the public is operating on risk assessment. They want to know the broader why to prevent the next one. And when institutions dismiss that broader why, people immediately start looking for who is controlling the narrative.
Which leads us straight into the accusation of media gaslighting. If the public doesn't trust the police press conference, they turn a skeptical eye to the journalists reporting on it.
Makes sense.
So the first major argument from the panel is presented by conservative commentator Bethany Mandel. She comes out swinging, accusing the media of actively deceiving the public about transgender mass shooters.
She points to specific editorial mechanics to make her case.
Yeah, she does.
She highlights how major legacy outlets like the New York Times and Reuters use the pronoun she when reporting on the biological male shooter in British Columbia.
Yes, and Mandel argues that by utilizing preferred pronouns in the aftermath of a massacre, the media is making a conscious choice to, in her words, honor that person's mental illness.
Wow, that's a strong phrase.
It is the crux of her stance, and it represents a highly controversial fundamental rejection of the current medical consensus. She argues that when someone begins dressing or acting as the opposite gender, it should not be celebrated as a journey of self-discovery.
How does she categorize it then?
She categorizes it strictly as a glaring signal of severe underlying psychological distress.
Yeah, okay, so because she frames it medically as a severe illness, her proposed societal mechanism for dealing with it changes drastically.
Right.
In her view, if a mental health professional sees someone in profound distress regarding their physical body, the responsible action is psychological treatment aimed at resolving the distress, not physical affirmation.
Exactly.
She argues that the societal model of affirming these beliefs is actually a barrier preventing vulnerable people from getting necessary psychiatric help.
And she actually takes it a step further. She argues that affirmation isn't just unhelpful, it acts as a dangerous accelerant. She calls it a recipe for disaster.
A recipe for disaster.
Yeah, and she outlines a very specific mechanism for how this radicalization allegedly happens.
Right. Mandel's recipe relies on three compounding ingredients. First is the sociological messaging. She argues that gender-affirming care comes bundled with a cultural narrative that tells these individuals they are part of a marginalized community that is perpetually under siege by the rest of society.
Under siege. And we know from basic psychology that if you constantly tell a group they are under existential threat, you trigger a persistent fight-or-flight response.
Oh, for sure. You create an us versus the world echo chamber.
Yeah. Then she adds the second ingredient, powerful hormones. The source notes she raises intense questions about the side effects of cross-sex hormones, suggesting they could induce suicidal or violent tendencies.
Like the black box warnings we see on other heavy pharmaceutical drugs.
Exactly. And finally, the third ingredient is the pre-existing mental illness she believes is the root cause to begin with.
So when you synthesize Mandel's argument, you take a psychologically vulnerable person, introduce powerful hormonal changes that may alter their emotional regulation, and culturally marinate them in the idea that society is trying to erase them.
Right.
In her view, this combination triggers a form of mass psychosis. She specifically points to the tragic murder of conservative commentator Charlie Kirk's friend by someone subscribing to this ideology as evidence of this lethal radicalization process.
But wait, how do we separate the alleged side effects of medical treatments from the individual's pre-existing mental state? I have to jump in and challenge this logic because we need to separate the rhetoric from the clinical reality.
Okay, fair point.
Mandel says affirmation is dangerous, but the mainstream medical consensus, organizations like the American Medical Association, usually argues the exact opposite.
Yeah, they do.
They state that denying gender-affirming care is what leads to severe depression and higher suicide rates. How does she square the circle of blaming the treatment that doctors say is meant to save lives?
See, that is the exact epicenter of the cultural divide right now. Mandel and the demographic she represents on this panel fundamentally distrusts that medical consensus.
They just don't buy it.
Nope. They look at the rising rates of anxiety, depression, and self-harm within this demographic and argue that the current consensus has the causality backward. They view the affirmation model as an ideological experiment that is exacerbating psychological distress rather than curing it.
Interesting.
They see the medical establishment as being captured by activism.
That is a staggering accusation against the medical community. Mandel is essentially framing this as an escalating systemic crisis driven by ideology.
A mass psychosis, what she said.
Right. But if we are facing a true systemic societal crisis, the warning signs should be flashing red across every national crime database.
You would think so.
Yet, when the other panelist, Brad Palumbo, pulls the actual numbers, the entire narrative shifts.
Yeah. Palumbo provides a vital, mathematically grounded counter-perspective. And to be clear, he doesn't dismiss the horror of the incidents.
No, not at all.
He acknowledges the devastating human toll. He even concedes the point that a suspect's identity and transition process might be highly relevant to an individual investigation, like the Rhode Island case with the divorce filings.
But he draws a massive, impenetrable line against taking the actions of those individual shooters and weaponizing them to condemn an entire demographic.
Exactly.
He strongly pushes back against what he calls the right's collective demonization of transgender people, and he brings hard data to dismantle the idea of a systemic threat.
He focuses on what statisticians might call the crisis of the denominator.
Oh, I like that term. What does that mean exactly?
Well, when you have a tragedy, do you judge the societal risk by looking at the numerator, the individuals who committed the act, or the denominator, the total population of that group?
Okay, I see.
Palumbo points out that there are over 2 million adults in the United States who identify as transgender. That is the denominator.
2 million. And the numerator, the number of shooters mentioned in this specific narrative, is 7. We're talking about fewer than 10 individuals out of 2 million.
It's a tiny fraction.
Let me repeat the math Palumbo brought to the panel because it entirely reorients the scale of the conversation.
Yep.
He calculates that those 7 individuals represent just 0.00004% of the transgender community.
0.00004%. By establishing that microscopic percentage, Palumbo shifts the focus away from the ideology of the shooters and onto the political hypocrisy of the commentators.
He really exposes a glaring contradiction in how certain political factions process risk.
Oh, absolutely.
There is a deep, dark irony here that Palumbo, as a center-right commentator himself, calls out directly. You have conservative politicians and pundits who usually treat the Second Amendment like a sacred text.
Right, the gun rights advocates.
When a mass shooting happens, their immediate default argument is, do not punish the law-abiding majority for the sins of a deranged few. Do not take our rights away because of a statistical anomaly.
We hear that all the time.
Yet suddenly, when the suspect happens to identify as transgender, that entire philosophy evaporates.
It's a complete 180.
They experience a 180-degree political whiplash, cheering for gun control for this specific group and treating an entire community of millions of people as an imminent, collective, violent threat.
It's quite the paradox.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Palumbo is pointing out that identity politics is a trap that both sides of the aisle fall into. When you abandon your core principles, like individual responsibility, just because you dislike the identity of the person involved, you are no longer analyzing crime. You are just participating in a culture war.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Palumbo grounds his argument in established sociological methodology. He references massive national databases, specifically the Gun Violence Archives and the Violence Prevention Project.
Okay, so he brought receipts.
He absolutely did. These organizations track the thousands of shootings that happen every year. And Palumbo's key takeaway from their methodology is entirely counterintuitive to the narrative Mandel is broadcasting.
Which is what?
That transgender individuals are actually underrepresented in mass shootings, not overrepresented, when you analyze the broader national statistics of gun violence.
Wow. So Palumbo brings undeniable math to defend a marginalized group from collective blame. But Mandel doesn't concede to the math, does she?
No, she doesn't. She argues that the numbers themselves are fundamentally compromised.
And this brings us to the most difficult, intractable part of this entire deep dive. How do you resolve a debate when the two sides cannot even agree on the foundational reality of the data?
This is the data dilemma of the modern age.
Yeah.
Mandel's counterargument to Palumbo's statistics is that you cannot generate accurate societal data if, well, she argues that if law enforcement agencies and major media outlets refuse to be honest about a suspect's biological sex from the moment a crime is reported.
So if internal protocols force them to prioritize preferred pronouns over biological reality?
Exactly. She says if that happens, then the data pipeline is flawed from the very start.
Uh, think of data collection like a municipal water filtration system.
Yeah.
Mandel is essentially arguing that if the intake pipe, the initial police reports and media articles, is selectively filtering out biological sex due to political correctness, then the water coming out of the tap, the national statistics from places like the Gun Violence Archive, is fundamentally contaminated.
Yeah, it's the garbage in, garbage out theory of statistics.
Exactly.
She believes the institutional capture by gender ideology renders the macroscopic data useless.
Right.
But despite this profound clash over whether the math can even be trusted, the source material reveals a surprising moment of nuance and middle ground between the two panelists.
It does, because Palumbo does not just offer a blanket defense of every aspect of transgender activism. He actually validates several core conservative concerns.
Yeah, he explicitly acknowledges the need for societal boundaries, which he calls guardrails.
Right. He agrees that the debates surrounding biological women's sports, the utilization of intimate spaces like locker rooms, and the protection of battered women's shelters are incredibly complex.
He concedes these aren't just bigoted talking points. They are legitimate areas requiring careful, pragmatic regulation.
Furthermore, he admits to the dark sociology of the internet. He acknowledges the existence of online cesspools of radicalism.
Which isn't unique to gender identity. I mean, it's a well-documented algorithmic phenomenon across the board.
Exactly. Deranged, isolated individuals find echo chambers online that validate their deepest grievances and escalate their violent ideations.
And Palumbo does not deny that this radicalization pipeline exists, or that certain individuals might latch onto a transgender identity as a vehicle for their underlying rage.
But his concluding point brings us right back to the denominator. He insists that despite the reality of algorithmic radicalization, and despite the complex need to establish societal guardrails in specific areas like sports, the vast, overwhelming majority of transgender adults are just decent, everyday people.
And we should quickly define what Palumbo means when he talks about this majority experiencing gender dysphoria.
A good idea.
In a clinical setting, gender dysphoria refers to the severe, persistent psychological distress that occurs when a person's biological sex does not align with their internal gender identity.
Yeah.
For the millions Palumbo is talking about, they are simply trying to manage this distress and navigate their lives.
Right. They aren't a violent vanguard. They are your neighbors, your coworkers, people paying their taxes. So what does this all mean? I want to ask you, the listener, directly.
Yeah.
How are you supposed to navigate a media landscape where even the foundational statistics are viewed as ideological weapons? When one side says, look at the math, this is a microscopic non-issue, and the other side replies, the institutions generating the math are lying to you.
This raises an important question about how we, as a society, establish truth. I mean, it challenges you to critically think about the mechanics of data collection.
It really does.
It forces us to ask how our own political echo chambers might be distorting our ability to accurately assess real-world risk. And fundamentally, it highlights the incredibly delicate tightrope a free society must walk.
Which is?
How do we protect the civil liberties, the dignity, and the individual rights of millions of people while simultaneously maintaining the vigilance required to identify and stop genuine public safety threats?
It is the defining question of our era. To briefly recap the complex terrain we've mapped out today, we started with the undeniable, horrific reality of these mass shootings.
The tragedies themselves.
Right. We explored Bethany Mandel's argument that society's rush to socially and medically affirm gender transitions is acting as a dangerous accelerant for already vulnerable, psychologically distressed individuals.
We broke down the mechanics of how being told you are under siege can trigger radicalization.
Yes, and then we balanced that with Brad Palumbo's argument, rooted in the crisis of the denominator. He mathematically demonstrated that taking the horrific actions of 0.0004% of a population and utilizing it to collectively demonize millions of law-abiding citizens is a profound violation of individual rights and a masterclass in political hypocrisy.
We are looking at two radically different sociological frameworks for processing the exact same tragedies. One lens focuses entirely on ideological and medical contagion as the root cause.
Right.
And the other relies on statistical proportion and the defense of individual liberty against collective blame.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over. We talked about the detective tossing out a puzzle piece, and we talked about the contaminated water supply of national statistics.
Right.
But consider this. If our fragmented media diets and our entrenched political loyalties dictate not only how we interpret the news, but the very math we choose to believe is real, how can society ever establish the mutual trust required to actually prevent the next tragedy?
Scary thought.
If we can't even agree on the shape of the puzzle pieces, how will we ever put the picture together to stop the next active shooter?
It's a structural challenge that goes far beyond the specifics of this single debate, striking at the core of how we function as a collective society.
It truly does. Thank you for joining us as we work through the mechanics of this incredibly complex issue. Remember, if you appreciate these structured, impartial deep dives into the hardest, most vital topics in the news, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to PoliticallyX. We will catch you on the next deep dive.